Welcome to the Modern Law Library. I'm your host, the ABA Journal's Lee Rawles, and today I'm joined by Diana Rickard, author of the book The New True Crime: How the Rise of Serialized Storytelling is Transforming Innocence. Diana, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation with you and your listeners.
True crime has a very long history in the media, whether it's, news, storytelling, or even murder ballads. Humans are fascinated by it, but there does seem to be some unique characteristics for the way discussions of true crime have started taking place, at least in American society. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that and about how you came to study this and to write this book.
Well, my book is about wrongful conviction and documentary storytelling. And it's important to me to emphasize that this is actually a project of critical criminology. And the true crime tradition, which, as you said, goes back a couple hundred years in this country, is generally a conservative project in that it focuses on, very sensationalized, lurid, grisly crimes and, the murderers among us. And there's a long fascination with the detective work involved in that, in the, the sort of horror of the stranger, as well as the horror of the person in the family that loses it. And, I've enjoyed those things as entertainment. I was not an avid true crime fan. Up until recently, the history of true crime was really true crime literature and true crime books. And, I used to watch the classic Law and Order. I like McCoy as much as anybody else, or hate McCoy as much as anybody else. But what happened was I became interested in wrongful conviction as something to look at academically in critical criminology. I have a friend who has been wrongfully convicted, who is still in prison in California. And when I started doing that research and reading up about it, I just came across so much good journalism and good documentary. I'd been familiar with some of it, and I wasn't sure as a scholar what I could contribute to the conversation that was going on. At the same time, I heard people talking about Serial and about making a murderer. And I remembered how taken I and many people I know were by Paradise Lost in the late 90s. And I said, there's something here. Wherever I go socially, people are talking about Adnan Syed and, really invested and passionate about, outraged about different injustices that they believe they saw in that case. And so that's what led me to looking at this form of true crime. And I call it the new true for two reasons. One, I see it as a departure from traditional true crime in that it is critical of the justice system. It is critical of the state. It is not looking at, the pervert in our midst. It is turning the criminological gaze from the deviant to the state and looking how state actors have violated rules and how state actors have victimized defendants. That is a thrust of these that I'm very interested in. The other reason I refer to this as the new true is because I specifically focus on cases that leave us with ambiguity. There are very interesting documentaries and podcasts about people who have been exonerated, it's proved that they were innocent. And I put those to the side because something that I see in the conversations around these series is a real polarization on what people think, a real frustration that they're maybe not left with answers at the end. And when you look at online discourses about it, people are really trying to grapple with, how do we know what is true? This is the evidence that should, make all the difference, or this should. And I see that as also something new in this kind of investigative reporting or this kind of storytelling. And then also, I said 2 reasons. I'll say a third reason these are new is that the history of these innocence documentaries were really feature length. The Thin Blue Line that came out, I believe, in 88 or 89, I remember seeing that in a theater. That was revolutionary at the time. Not that long after was Capturing the Freedmans. These were feature-length movies in theaters. Since streamers took over, they discovered that viewers will watch 10 hours of one story. And that level of detail is new. That level of the attention that we're willing to give to these cases is new.
I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in, as a podcaster, the wave of true crime podcasts. I think that one thing a podcast allows you to do that you can't do when you're sitting down to watch 10 hours of a true crime documentary is you're listening to it while you're doing other things. Listener, I think about you when I record these episodes and I wonder, I'm like, am I helping you fold laundry? Am I with you on your daily commute? Are you walking the dog? It's media that people can consume while they're doing other things. And that's a personal theory I have about why some true crime podcasts really took off is, well, it provides some of the same content or intellectual stimulation that one of these documentaries would, but you're not having to sit down and pay attention and look at visual stimuli. You're doing whatever else you want to be doing. You described yourself in the book as not a podcast person. So what was it like to be listening to all of these true crime podcasts in addition to, watching these documentaries in order to do your research?
I think I have a similar hunch to you about why people listen to podcasts, how that's a different experience. And I think in the case of Serial, one of the things that made it so compelling is Sarah Koenig, like her voice and her kind of processing. And, she would talk to someone and then she'd be like, I don't know what this means. It could mean this, but then I think that. And her voice becomes very familiar, and her way of thinking and asking questions becomes part of the story. So in the visual documentaries, the documentarian is not as much a part of the story and is not someone you grow close to. And so I think that is very different. Something else I've noticed is in looking at other true crime podcasts that are not about innocence issues. There, as you mentioned, there's a ton. One that I found really engaging was My Favorite Murder, which is I don't believe they have any expertise, just 2 women that enjoy true crime. They're funny, they're
they're professional
engaging
comedians. Yeah, they're performers.
Right. So they're comedians, but they do background research on the stories that they tell. So when you tune in to hear, one of their true crime stories, you're also just like listening to them chat and talk about things. And that's very, very different than these documentaries. And I think that podcasts have entered our lives in these kind of different ways, like also not related to true crime. Some of the podcasts I listen to regularly, it used to annoy me, the sort of like chit chat catch up at the beginning, but now I kind of feel like they're my friends and I am actually interested, in their whatever anecdotes. So definitely podcasts are a different experience. And when I first started, yes, I was not a podcast person. I resisted Serial for a long time because I didn't want to listen to a podcast. And, I had to because of my work. I would listen very, very carefully, stop constantly to take notes. So that's not the way a regular person listens to a podcast.
I assume not anyway. Yeah, but if anyone out there is taking notes on my episodes, would love to see them. That sounds fascinating.
Actually, after doing my research on online conversations, it is quite possible that people are stopping and taking notes because of the level of their involvement. But, it's listening to podcasts becomes a habit. Once I became acclimated to it, I do listen to things, more as my own recreational consumption.
Are there any podcasts that you started listening to just for work that now you would recommend to people or enjoy listening? You mentioned that now you will just turn them on, and now you do feel more of a connection to the hosts.
So the true crime ones, that is interesting. Maybe I got burnt out by them listening to researching this. There are some good ones that are the ones I listen to are long form storytelling. There are a lot of episodic ones. Maggie Freeling is a journalist who who looks at innocence issues every week, a different case. With these series, they need to keep coming up with new takes or new stories, right? As, commercial media products, they can't keep doing the same thing. And Maggie Freeling has a long form true crime documentary, a podcast called Murder in Alliance. And it kind of takes us to a different place. I don't, no spoilers, but I thought that one was really interesting.
So Murder in Alliance, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. And then we can talk. You can feel free to message me if you.
Much like you, I actually went through a period of listening to a lot of true crime podcasts, but I found myself needing to stop. First of all, I was walking my dog late at night, and as anyone who has consumed much of the genre knows, a lot of the stories that receive attention and focus are violence visited upon women, and the women who generally are profiled are, white women, often, but not necessarily, middle class. But there's plenty of issues of race and gender that get implicated when it comes to whose story gets told. And I think that that's, that's relevant both for who is the victim and also who was charged with the crime, convicted of the crime. Do you see a movement within the new true to look at that tendency that we've had in the media? And I will also say studies have shown that more attention is paid by the media as well to victims who are white, victims who are women, who are affluent, missing. If there are missing stories, you look at the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women, they are not getting the same attention as sometimes the one-off white women victims, things of this nature. So that's a long way to ask it, but do you think that the new true is ready to reckon with this or doing anything to, I don't know that fight back is the term, but shift our focus?
I'm not sure that they are or that they're doing it well enough. What you point to is this need for the victim in a crime story, whether it's a wrongful conviction story or not, to be what we call an ideal victim, which is usually on the younger side, white, conventionally attractive, and middle class. And that is a terrible way that we decide whose victimization is worthy, whose victimization is wrong. And it's also a terrible way that we bestow the mantle of innocence and victim. And I talk about this, I think most comes up when I look at the Atlanta murders podcast and documentary about that. Most of these series, the victims were white and middle class. The West Memphis 3, the victims were white boys. The others were in Serial, Heyman Lee is an Asian woman, but she functions, I think, in the way she's talked about. In fact, I read an article called The Whiteness of True Crime, and they were talking about her, and it's like, she wasn't white, but she was middle class, she was very pretty, she was a high achiever, she was young. So she kind of was able to, satisfy our need for that ideal victim. But in the Atlanta murders, the victims were impoverished mainly boys, impoverished Black boys in Atlanta. And that case was treated very, very differently. They weren't reported, they weren't taken seriously. It was, 28 murders. The parents were vilified for their poverty. So it is a different story, and it is talked about in a different way. So I don't think these series are doing much to push back on it in an explicit way. But I do think that they have in common just the fact that they're making us see the state as having far too much power, and they allow us to kind of see how people become vulnerable, how marginalized people can become vulnerable to this state power. So to answer your question, no, I don't think they are critical enough. And I don't think they are changing that narrative enough. But I think they are creating audiences that are more capable of thinking differently, of grappling with things rather than assuming things, and, of challenging some of the status quo.
And Diana, something your book made me think about is the difference between crime journalism and, court reporting and these new true storytellers in who they're talking to, who their sources are. You had a great quote in the book that I'm going to read really quickly that, makes me think of this as well. Although true crime is always constructed through techniques of minimization, exaggeration, speculation, and point of view, both consumers and creators believe it to depict just the facts. But, as I can say as a journalist, the facts depend on who you're talking to and who you're getting it from. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, there in the past has been a more conservative bent to stories of true crime because the people who were being interviewed about it were generally the police or, the court system, the government often was passing along these stories. If you are a court reporter, you generally have a long-standing relationship with prosecution, with defense attorneys, with court staff. You know them. You have worked with them on a number of stories. Police will do press releases. The state's attorney will do a press release, and you quote from that. You may have an interview with the victim's family. It is not likely that a defense attorney is going to let you talk to their client. On the other hand, the true crime people are coming at this generally, in the cases you're looking at, these are innocent stories. So in general, the person has been convicted. And what do they have left to lose and they're agreeing to work with the new true storyteller, but the victim's family may not be willing to talk to them. It is unlikely that the prosecutor who, did the case is going to talk to this storyteller. It's just very unlikely that the state, because it feels it's put this to bed or has convicted someone for it, is going to participate in the interview. So you're hearing from different sets of people. And I would love to hear your take on that, how you think it influences things and changes things for just the general public to go from these two sets of information.
So my hunch is that when people make a documentary, they are cognizant that they are presenting a version of truth rather than the truth. But I also think that they lose sight of that. And one thing that I think a lot of these series do that is very smart is they make the media around the case part of the story. So one kind of trope that they use is they will show people as the cameras are being set up, you know what I mean? Like as they fix their tie and make an off comment. So seeing people on the court steps getting ready to present what they want to be their version of truth for the journalists and the media is something that they are, de facto looking critically at by showing it. And absolutely, you're right. Most news stories are coming from official sources. And in most of these, the prosecutors do not want to talk to the filmmakers, nor do the victims' families. This is in some ways valuable, in some ways quite troubling, because by turning the gaze to the state as the bad guy, there is a sense that they are minimizing or delegitimizing or pathologizing the victim's rage and pain and outrage, because quite often the victims are seen as, the victims' families of the murdered people are seen as like preening for the camera, or, you know, sort of manufacturing a sense of outrage, or having their outrage expressed in such strong terms that they don't come off well, or the editing choices of the documentarians are not making them come off well. And by well, I mean they're coming off purely from their sense of outrage and pain and needing vindication and needing retribution. And as a criminologist and as a professor of criminal justice issues, retribution, whether we like it or not, whether we're proud of it or not, plays an important role in our criminal justice system. So in most of these series, the original series is then part of a follow-up, and you do hear how victims felt about how they were portrayed. So it does show these different aspects or these different viewpoints or these different camera lenses on the phenomenon.
In many of my episodes, I ask the author of the book to read a short excerpt so people can get kind of a feel for the language. And we selected an excerpt I'd love for you to read, because I think that it does a great job of illuminating some important things about this group that you call the New True.
The New True all seek to humanize subjects deemed monstrous through the demonizing mechanisms available to criminal justice. These series present dramatic narratives around the process of assigning guilt through trials, the mechanism employed by the law to designate an individual as deserving of punishment and to legally strip them of their rights. In this analysis, meaning my analysis, we see that these series look critically at the way deviance is leveraged in service of exclusion. The conviction in these cases are based largely on character, in essence enacting punishment not for what the defendant did, but for their, quote, nature, so that we can be safely disposed of as legal slaves stripped of civil rights and status. Although the filmmakers do not unequivocally strong-arm audiences into conclusion, their perspective points to the injustice of using such patently prejudiced and biased beliefs that are counter to the ideals of our system and hinder the functioning of healthy democracy. Wrongful conviction can potentially expose serious cracks in the system and undermine the legitimacy of punishment, exclusion, and penal harm. By making visible the manipulation of social deviance categories, the New True bring the criminal justice system into sharper focus. The enormous outcry and viewer engagement surrounding these cases and the role both have played in the proceedings and outcomes of individual cases demonstrate that these series have an effect in the real world. All have had powerful emotional impact on viewers, some who could not sleep at night after watching. Altered viewers' behavior created demands for institutional action and contribute to continued legal proceedings. The series makers importantly shine light on how deviance is unjustly used in convicting the innocent and help viewers to see this as inappropriate extra-legal information. In this way, they expose and critique popular and sadly enduring cultural beliefs about deviance, evil, and exclusion, pushing the boundaries of true crime in an era currently being shaped by movements for criminal justice reform.
Well, thank you for reading that passage that in the hardcover is on page 127 to 128. We're going to take another break. Diana, you have mentioned a couple times the audience, and not just the general audience, but the involved audience. It's time to talk about Reddit. So I think that there have been groups communicating online about various, crimes and mysteries and cold cases since it was, text only chats, IRC, message boards. But the Reddit communities that have grown up around some of these innocence cases are so fascinating. And I would love to hear you talk about what you found when you delved into, say, the Making a Murderer channel or any of the others. What were your discoveries?
Well, I had not been a Reddit user. I use Facebook socially, but I have not, followed groups around interests that I care about. So I have a chapter called Judging the Jury that looks at these online forums, like including Rotten Tomatoes, where people review and discuss these issues. And by far, most of the discussion and the most substantive discussion is on Reddit. I had been worried about Reddit because I, thought it was like right-wing extremists saying horrible, violent stuff. And I also thought it was, people screaming at each other. And I was quite surprised. I found on these forums or these threads, channels about these series to be incredibly thoughtful. Like in my chapter, I will say how many words a post was. It would be like 1,400 words. These folks, and they're not typical viewers, but they do show us how people are thinking. These posts were incredibly thoughtful, incredibly detailed. The discussions were polite. People who didn't agree were not insulting each other. And I saw comments in response to a very long, thread saying, thank you so much for this. I hadn't thought about it this way. This really changes how I'm thinking of it. Or, you bring up the date book in Teresa Hallback's car. I didn't realize how important this was, but you're showing me that. And I thought that was very interesting, just that humanity is not as bad as I thought it might be. And I think that, one of the reasons I was excited to talk to your audience is, a legal podcast is because I feel kind of hopeful about people's understanding, the general lay public's understanding of legal concepts. And even if they're getting that understanding from entertainment. So people on Reddit would really, scrutinize in such detail the evidence that in the shows that are provided already in such detail. And people on Reddit did talk, like when I was talking about it, Atlantic Monster, they did talk about the racism and the racist way that case was framed. They also a number of the defendants in these come from poor rural environments where the victim was more middle class, and the way that, rural poverty becomes cloaked in, these kind of deep beliefs about evil. The Redditors saw all that and were critical of all that. And one of the reasons I had that chapter in the first place was because I look so deeply at the way they present evidence and, kind of do a textual analysis of, what the arguments are that the defense is making, the prosecutor is making, the documentarians are making. And I wanted to see what was pervasive, what was persuasive to users, to Redditors. And it was just very illuminating.
Absolutely. I will say Reddit is like a lot of little federations. Channels are run by volunteer moderators. So if you were looking for some screaming or horrifying right-wing viewpoints, you could find that. But yeah, no, I think that it is always interesting to see how much time people are prepared to devote to analyzing this. You say a 1,400-word post, someone spent their spare time putting that together. And one thing I will say is when it comes to innocence, just to ground people in my own experience and where I'm coming from talking about this, when I was in grad school for journalism, I was at Northwestern University, which has a very famous Innocence Project, which I did not work with directly, but was around. And while I was in grad school, it coincided with the governor of Illinois deciding that since there had been 14 exonerations at that point from Illinois' death row, something was deeply wrong with the Illinois justice system's capital cases. And eventually, he froze the death penalty. Eventually, he exonerated everyone, converted the sentences to life in prison, and Illinois no longer has a death penalty. A lot of the exonerations, many of them were DNA, but as you mentioned in the book, that's actually not how many of the innocence cases end up being solved or coming out. It is often, misdeeds, etc. Many of the concepts that were deeply puzzling to people in Illinois in 2003, 2002, 2004, as all of this debate was happening, I think are now more generally accepted, and it's because of the popularization of them. I'm going to bring up an example, which is false confessions. In the early 2000s, as we were having this public debate, I heard over and over again, but no one would falsely confess. Who would say they'd done something? How could you say, yes, I killed my sister, when you didn't, when you were innocent? Who would do that? But I heard the interview tapes from a case that sticks with me back in grad school where they were playing this for us to show us how this could be done. The case was very sad. It was a teen boy, and in the hours of questioning and interrogation, he became convinced because the police officers kept suggesting, well, have you ever kind of done something without, have you ever sleepwalked? Have you ever done something without, really fully knowing it? Became convinced he'd killed his little sister. And he, it was proven that it actually had been, I think it was an intruder, but showed me, oh yeah, false confessions happen through a variety of ways, but that was not publicly accepted. But false confessions now I think are more generally understood as a phenomenon. I mean, that's my perception. Is that what you were seeing in some of these true crime podcasts, that people were more accepting of instances like false confessions or forensic evidence that turns out to be junk science?
Sadly, not enough. So false confessions, I think now there is a greater understanding that they happen. We've had video of seeing, what is wrong in making a murderer. I don't know if you saw that one, but the video coerced investigations of Brandon Dassey are they're so excruciatingly painful. It is impossible for me to believe that someone could watch that and think that that was a legitimate confession. And there are others that we see in these series. And there is a lot of evidence and understanding of the different ways these coercive techniques work to elicit a false confession. There's a lot of knowledge about, who is more susceptible to doing that. And yet, as far as I know, still, a confession is one of the most persuasive things to a jury. Even juries who see those tapes. So maybe there is a growing awareness that these things happen and what's wrong with them. And maybe jurors are somewhat more, questioning of what they're seeing. But this is something that is just incredible to me, that people do think you wouldn't confess to something you didn't do. And if you confess, there must be something that you did that made you. even watching, something that is just so tragic and sad. The other important cause of wrongful convictions is witness misidentification. It's very powerful. If a witness comes into a courtroom and says, yes, that person there, that woman with the short hair and glasses and the polka dot sweater is absolutely the woman that assaulted me and did this to me. And I made a point of, committing her face to memory. And this is what happened. People are wrong when they say that. There is so much evidence that for a number of reasons, people make that mistake. And yet it is very hard to convince a jury that happens. The case in Making a Murderer is actually about Stephen Avery, who had been convicted, who was released after 18 years in prison for raping a woman that, had said that, like, I know this is him. And it was later, DNA showed it wasn't him. And she was horrified. She lives with terrible guilt. She was being completely honest. You know what I mean? That was her impression. She believed it at the time, and she was terribly wrong. But this still happens because the people asserting that this is true really believe it. Like something has happened cognitively and in their memory function and in the images in their mind and recreating things. But in terms of the documentaries, they show how messed up interrogation procedures and messed up eyewitness identification procedures, including like allowing a witness to see a potential suspect like walk down the hall before she sees them in the lineup. There are all these things that are clearly messed up, to someone doing critical thinking that these series show.
And often, much like with the field of psychology and recovered memories, it's not necessarily even, that the police intentionally were trying to achieve a particular outcome so much as it was, we thought that this was okay, or we didn't think about how this would twist in someone's mind. Many therapists in the 80s thought that they were genuinely uncovering examples of satanic ritual abuse when they were introducing memories into people's heads.
Yes, and much more, sort of more subtle things than that are constantly happening, including, just a slight way of phrasing a question when a witness is identifying something, or, just a way of, putting one Polaroid in front of the other, or mentioning a piece of information, that only the perpetrator had that gives it to them. And this is just so well documented, but like the false confessions, it goes against what juries see as common sense.
So I would love, because, you are a criminologist, you're in academia, you must have, many connections within the, innocence community. What do people who work on exonerations, in your experience, feel about some of these new true shows? Do they see this as helpful? Do they see it as separate for what they're doing? Do they try and when they have a case they think needs public attention, try and get that attention through one of these? I'm just interested in what your perception is of how the innocence community views some of these more pop culture products.
I think with some sense of ambivalence. Anybody who is an expert, deeply immersed in something, is going to watch a representation of it and see the things that they got wrong, or that they, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So I think there is that kind of, knee-jerk protection, frustration. But they do also see that it is helping, that if nothing, it is providing case studies. If nothing, I think these have done a great job of promoting all the different innocence projects and getting people to want to be involved in innocence projects. I mention in my book a real life housewife from Orange County who watched one of these and became outraged, and she's an attorney and she volunteered her time at the California legal project. So that is definitely helpful. Also, these documentaries do a really good job of including important experts as talking heads. That if you watch these, there's this like ecosystem where you see the same questionable forensic scientists in one case after another, and you see the same innocence movement scholars. And there's the attorneys who represented Brandon Dassey and his appeals, because he was the teenager that just had such a painful false confession. They do a podcast on false confessions, like episodic looks at different cases of how this works.
And when it comes to questionable forensic science, I was thrilled to see you shout out in the book PBS Frontline. The ABA Journal was one of the first print publications to question bite mark forensics, which many claims have been made about being able to match bite marks in a sandwich, for example, to a bite mark on human skin, and it's bunk. It's not real. But places like PBS Frontline have shown a light on some of these questionable forensic things. Arson science used to just be,
Yes.
Basically a bunch of retired firefighters and old wives' tales. And, I don't think that all of them meant harm. They probably just felt that they had an expertise. But the way they thought fire behaved is not accurate now that we have institutions who study fire and fire science. We can show that's not how an acceleration point looks. That's not what happens when there's a flashover. Things of this nature. And I do think that places like PBS, through programs like Frontline, have done a good job of trying to bring that to light and hopefully stop some of the questionable forensic science from going forward.
Yes, and that is starting to happen. PBS has been great. I'm thinking of I'm sure maybe it's 12 years old. The Real CSI does a real good job of looking at these different forms of either discredited or very questionable forms of forensic science. The bite mark analysis has been implicated in a very famous exoneration of two men in Mississippi. There is also now a real understanding of hair fiber analysis and what is wrong with that. I believe for quite some time, when hair fiber doesn't provide DNA evidence, it doesn't provide any evidence. Other like super high close-ups of a hair follicle is not going to provide enough forensic evidence to take someone's life away.
Which I think, when I run my hand through my hair and I look at the strands, even when I just did that, I see that the strands are different widths. One may be super curly, the other's not. I think that some of these, once it's explained, yeah, that's not real, you can think your way through to be like, yeah, that doesn't seem like it would provide much information.
Totally. And then to go back to my admiration for investigative journalism, I remember a decade or two ago, the New Yorker magazine had a piece like, "Did Texas execute an innocent man?"
I believe that was David Allen Cameron.
Yes. And also I think maybe PBS did a follow-up on that article. But it explains what you just said about these changes in fire analysis and the way it did used to be considered, quote unquote, an art, and a fire investigator would go in and sort of use their intuition or their experience, but, not really these scientific methods of analyzing and how kind of informal it was. And I think related, another thing these documentaries are exposing is this real lack of professionalism, in these rural areas where the law enforcement aren't particularly well trained and everybody knows each other and, no one is going to contradict.
Well, and the coroner doesn't have to be a doctor. In so many jurisdictions, the coroner is an elected position without any sort of, degree required. You ran for coroner and you're going to be the one who says how someone died. There just aren't enough medical examiners, qualified medical examiners out there to look at every body.
Absolutely. And some of these small rural communities they're depicted in An Innocent Man and they're depicted in Making a Murderer are just really distrustful of people that, they haven't been working with for 20 years. And, one person writing about the prosecutor's office and the law enforcement in Ada, Oklahoma, which was where the cases regarding the Invisible Man took place, was like, this is deliverance country, meaning the movie.
There's a difference in resources. I grew up in a town with 400 people in it, and there wasn't a grocery store, let alone a forensics lab. So,
right.
Well, Diana, I want to thank you so much for coming on to talk with us. Obviously, readers, listeners who are looking to read more can pick up The New True Crime: How the Rise of Serialized Storytelling is Transforming Innocence. But do you have any other recommended reading for people who are interested in this as a topic, how the new true is influencing innocence? Would love to hear any recommendations you have for the listeners.
Well, there are two books, general nonfiction, not scholarly books, that I think touch on some things that we didn't talk about, which was the sort of journalist subject, documentarian subject relationship, which is, this gets to that objectivity we were talking about. Mm-hmm. Like the documentarian Andrew Jarecki, who did the Jinx, the Robert Durst case, who ended up kind of proving that he was guilty based on something he said on the subject said on a hot mic. Mm-hmm. That is a real twist on this idea that most of these defendants who are participating in these interviews are expecting the documentarian to be their champion and their advocate, not just reporting the facts. And that's why they want to participate in that. There's a book that explores that kind of journalist-subject relationship in depth. It's an older book by Janet Malcolm called The Journalist and the Murderer.
Janet Malcolm, read anything she's written. Honestly, Janet Malcolm is a queen.
Absolutely. Then we were talking at the beginning about the interest in true crime. By far, readers of and consumers of true crime are women. There's some speculation on why that is the case. But Rachel Monroe wrote an incredible book called Savage Appetites that looks at what are the types of fans of true crime. I mean, it's a great read. There's really fascinating portraits in there. So those, I think, more for a general reader would be very interesting.
So one thing that I definitely want to address before we let you leave and get back to your day is, when I read your conclusion, you seemed deeply unsettled and a little pessimistic about some of the things you found in the research of this book. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that and any perils you see or reasons for you to come away feeling uneasy about the way that we narrate these wrongful conviction stories.
Yes. There is an inherent problem with focusing on innocent defendants in the context of criminal justice reform and the injustices and oppression that happen through our criminal justice system. Our punishment system is far more severe than other peer nations. The what we do to our prisoners and our inmates and our vulnerable populations who are over policed and harassed and stopped and frisked. These stories kind of let us off the hook because of the way of who they humanize. And in a way, I can see them as making claims on who's deserving of punishment. And I think that is a political issue and a moral issue. It doesn't let us address is putting people in solitary confinement for 5 years okay, even if they did do something. And this is something that is part of our larger punitive culture. We were talking about the death penalty. States that have the death penalty also seem to have much higher rates of wrongful conviction because there's this belief in a crime control model that is get the bad guys no matter what you have to do. You have to plant evidence, you have to bully the perps, get it, whatever you have to do. That's only going to increase wrongful conviction, but it is also increasing unjust punishment. And there is a documentary that I found really helpful with that called Free Meek on Amazon Prime that expands what do we mean by innocent, who are we including in that. People, who are, I believe, unjustly managed and controlled in an oppressive way by the conditions of probation and parole or arrest warrants and all of that. And that is not in there. And also, I think the unease you're referring to is my sense of post-truth politics and this kind of weird existential place we find ourselves in where truth is relative. So the same thing that drew me to these documentaries, that they give us a way of sitting with ambiguity, of looking at two versions of the truth, like looking at a fact that is interpreted one way by the defense and another way by the prosecution, interpreted one way by the defendant, another way by the documentarian. I think as much as I find a lot of value in that, I am worried. I feel like when I wrote that book, I thought we were in a post-truth moment. I'm wondering if we're getting into a post-moral moment. So I think that is the unease you were picking up on.
Well, thank you so much for that. And if people wanted to engage with you more about these or pick up any of your other research, you've written another book as well. How can they reach out to you? Do you have a website, an email address you'd like to share?
I'm an associate professor at Borough of Manhattan Community College, and my email is there. I'm happy to say it's drickard@bmcc.cuny.edu. And I also want to say to your legal listeners, there's some chapters where I talk about the nitty-gritty of legal concepts such as the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, and Alford pleas, and the role they have in these series. And again, I think they are discussed both in these series and in Reddit forums and discussions outside the series in pretty nuanced, sophisticated ways.
Well, thank you to you, Diana, and to you, my listeners, for joining us for this episode of the Modern Law Library. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast listening app, and you can rate and review. That helps us out a lot. And you can also reach out if you have a book that you would like me to cover in a future episode. You can reach me at books@abajournal.com.